Hey, it's Crumbs. You're lost? How do you not know where you are? It's Thorin's channel.
Right, this is going to be the second episode of Watch the Overture with me and Yiska. And for this one, the topic we wanted to discuss is one that I actually think is a pretty key one to the Overwatch League in particular, because it underlies everything that happens. And unfortunately, I just know that this is the way things go. When people are discussing things like how good a team is, what a team's current form is like, there's already so many variables and factors that end up making it something of like your brain tends to think of a team in a static way, like, right, this team is good now, and since they are good, winning against this team means they are good, and if they lose to this, and so unfortunately it's already tough, because anytime you want to make a qualitative decision on something, the quickest way to do it is actually restrict the factors as much as possible and find like a consistent metric, usually one or two factors from which to make a decision. So that's a roundabout way of saying we're going to approach what I actually think is one of the biggest topics in the Overwatch League, which is patching. And so as much as people, I've noticed, teams essentially don't actually tend to discuss this topic except when a new patch is out. Then they will discuss it, how we've been adapting or what it's changed, but they will never themselves say things like, oh, well, I think this team's just on the rise only because like this thing came in the meta and changed that, where they tend to talk about like, oh, they're just a good team and stuff. And they also do this thing, which we'll definitely get into, but it's one thing that tilts the fuck out of me, which is people will say that like it's not a big deal basically if there is patching, even if it's drastic patching, because what they'll say is the best team adapts. Now that is patently circular logic, because what they do is whoever wins is the best team, and therefore they go, well, since my formulation is the best team adapts, whoever won adapted, and therefore congratulations, you adapted. Even though I have seen in many games with patching, including Overwatch and specifically the Overwatch League, teams that were very good, laid low by patches, specifically tended to be ones obviously that hit a star player or his hero pool. Meanwhile, we've obviously seen players and teams risen to higher positions, usually not number one, admittedly, primarily by patches. So first of all, let's actually just start with what should always be the first principles of a discussion like this, which is, should there be patching? Should it be something that is a part of the esports side of the game? I mean, for example, if you wanted to be very strict, obviously Overwatch the game is going to be patched. So, but someone could say, should they only have one patch for a whole stage, for example, and then the playoffs in that stage is on the patch, and then okay, everyone knows, right, the day stage one ends, stage two patch comes in, and then maybe that means Overwatch League doesn't get every single patch that the fans do, but maybe they get, let's say, for example, in this formulation, I'm assuming that you'd want the most consistent patch, or the one that made the sense of the two or three that would go on in the casual world outside of Overwatch League. So let's start there. Where do you come down on that one? Are patches necessary? Do we need patches?
Yeah. So the thing is, here's actually a point where I feel like esports has to sort of take the route of the audience or the casual player base, because if you think about it, one of the big factors why people actually watch is because they go like, oh, like Jonek just hit that sick headshot from that angle. Like, I want to try to do this and maybe relate to how hard it is or feel like that, right?
Sure.
Right? So if they are not playing the same game, that in one aspect is completely whack, in my opinion, like it's right now. So I think that should be the first thing, where you have to play on the same patch than your audience. Obviously, that's currently not the case. But the reason why we need patches is, in esports in general, unless you have like a cult following, which was the case, I guess, in StarCraft Brood War, I think just because how much players interact with their hobby, so to speak, in esports, so play the game, watch the matches, is so much higher than in basically all other sports. It tends to get very boring. Like, imagine if someone legitimately watched like all the games of Overwatch League and then played maybe 20 hours a week in the game as well. That's a full-time job now, right? And that tends to get boring if it's always the same thing. Now, obviously, it's also the case that balance is not immediately achieved, and I'm sure, as we will talk about this later, Blizzard is not the pinnacle of balancing esports titles. So
sure.
It's I think definitely there's some patches needed for novelty reasons, but also just for general balance overall.
Okay. Because if we get into that world, like I could definitely make like a case as to why I think patches aren't that good. But I will say that I think it's an unfair discussion because there's not really a proper control group. Because if you think about it, right, every game that succeeded without patching, so the two most famous examples that come to mind is StarCraft Brood War, which did not have a patch basically during the entire Kesper era of that game. So basically any great StarCraft Brood War player you can think of from Korea, he was not playing with patches. Now, first of all, they did have sort of their own version of patching, which was they could change the racial balance, like where the Reserve is more powerful than the Terran, by changing the map pool. So that actually was a way of altering it without having access to the game itself to alter it, because obviously the terrain of the game in an RTS game has a big component of how the game's going to go and how the metagame plays out. That is true. But within that, there were massive evolutions and progressions and different... Sometimes, sometimes something did leave into a cul-de-sac of one evolutionary chain, but then that meant that a different evolutionary chain took over later on. And there were all these amazing components. And the other one, obviously, that I would cite would be Counter-Strike, because Counter-Strike generally wasn't really patched much beyond 1.6. It just sort of... That's why the name stayed as 1.6 for almost a decade, because it was sort of the same game with some very minor tweaks that didn't really affect the metagame or gameplay. But I will say, in the case of those two games, the reason why I think it's not fair to make the case that that you could have a game with no competitive patching is because almost certainly those two games have a survivorship bias where they were maybe just fabulous games anyway, and either had the depth in which you could develop them without patching, or if we'd have had 10 games like that, maybe 8 of them would have died. These 2 would have survived, and therefore now you could have easily said, well, what about the 8 that didn't make it and did get very stale, and, maybe they never got too far with that. But what I will do is I'll take the principle of that, which I do agree with, which is that those are 2 of my favourite games for that very reason, that I know the guy who's the champion in 2009 is completing in the same game as the best player from 2004. There is something cool to that. But what I will say is this. I do think Overwatch and League of Legends, which are the 2 games I think have been the worst, in my opinion, for general balance, because so much of the balance was done in favor of the casual player, and then it just happened to bleed into the way that the competitive game is played. Whereas, for example, a game like Dota 2, which still definitely does base around casual players, it has a cult following, and it tends to be fairly hardcore players. So I always felt like they kind of got away with it a bit there, because you're almost sort of balancing to some degree for your notion of what Dota should be like, You're not always going for like a radically different game, which in the case of League of Legends is how that game's become. Like a solo queue version of League of Legends and a PoE game are now so far apart that it just becomes even more of a problem when you try and balance a hero or a metagame. So the point I'll bring into that to try and find a happy compromise, because I think this is a great topic to discuss now, because we're going to give some examples hopefully and get into giving some reasons as to where people will see from like how a team did in stage 2 or stage 3. What I would say is this: once you accept that there's going to be patching and that it is necessary on some level, the question for me becomes, how long do you leave a patch in? Like, how long does a life cycle of a patch get to last? And while it would seem very neat before to say, right, we'll just make it a stage or make it a stage in the playoffs, the bigger issue for me is I don't think any developers ever managed to figure out when a patch is tapped out for novelty or evolution or progression within it. Because as you're saying here, okay, so within the first moment you bring a patch in, there'll be, I would say, off the top of my head from most games, I'd say it's usually like 1 to 2 weeks that there's the confusion, there's the chaos of like, okay, one team has like immediate success. Maybe their star players fit the heroes that are used, or the role that's now more emphasized, or the stylistic aspects, or to use a stage, for example here, obviously Boston was immediately hit by the fact that dive is not the best way to play anymore, and actually you can't necessarily run dive all the time. And those 2 factors combined meant it doesn't matter what the performance of Striker is like, it doesn't matter how Gamsu plays, it doesn't matter how the coaches coach the team, they're not going to be the number 1 team very likely. Like if they did, if anything, they would probably have to massively overachieve in individual performance to some absurd level, if not come up with overnight some radical new way to play the game. So immediately a team like that is hit by it. Now, the issue I have is this. After a couple of weeks, it tends to settle out. Because think about it, that's like 2 solid weeks teams have had to not only practice the game, they've played a few official games, so they've gotten the hard feedback of what really works in a match. The big issue I have is this. Most game developers then notice that off the top of my head, again, these are rough numbers, I would say there's usually, say, like a 3 or 4 week span where people now have a level of comfort, whether they're comfortable in the game or not. They understand the patch. They feel like, right, I've got a good read on the patch. This is what it's all about. Now, my problem is this. With how quickly games tend to be patched, especially for the casual fan base, that's actually... You're normally not even going to get to that point. Like, that's like 6 weeks in, I'm talking here. You might not even get that long before the next patch comes. And here is the problem. From games that were patched less often or not at all, the problem is this. When people think that they have solved the game and they have got a basic sense and read on the meta, there is nearly always at least one more sort of generation of progression of the meta. Like, someone will then come up to with a counter which didn't initially suggest itself for logical reasons because we didn't have a set meta. But once you get a set meta, there will always be a hero you didn't think was viable or a style that actually wasn't working against the first things tried, but now works against the dominant meta. And then if you are the team who has the players to pull that off, suddenly you get some success. Sometimes you even then become the number 1 team and everyone else finds out, right, actually what we thought worked in the meta doesn't work now that this is introduced. That's where I come into some issues with the competitive side of the game, because I will fully admit this is not a science. It's very tough to know when this point is hit and when you should patch next. But the reason why I bring it up is because in every game I know, like League of Legends, like Overwatch, where there's not great balancing and there tends to be periods where people will say, this hero champion is busted, the meta is stale, everyone does this. That tends to be around the time it solidifies. And so if your impulse is patch now, you'll never actually let the game get to what can be the cool evolutions of that, like, sort of counter revolution, as it was. You know, you had the revolution of what worked, and then you have the counter revolution, which sometimes can upend it or provide an interesting balance, as it were. So where would you come down on that?
Yeah, I think it's actually, if we think about this, for instance, like a hero like Orisa, right? Usually in Overwatch, especially before we really professionalized with the Overwatch League, it took so long to introduce new heroes into the competitive meta. It's not even that these heroes needed to be buffed necessarily. I specifically remember, yes, there were some Ana buffs back in the day, yes. But it's also what people hopefully understand is that hero balance is not something that's just, the health of the kit or the coherence of the kit as this one character or hero. It's the interdependencies between all of those ecosystems.
Yes.
Right? So, for instance, famously, the formerly of Blizzard Entertainment, now Riot Games, the guy's called Ghostcrawler.
Yes.
Right?
One of the main game devs.
Yeah, and he was a marine biology, which makes sense, right? Because he looks like a pufferfish, and he also, he understands how an ecosystem works, right?
Yes.
Like, if you have that hero, that balances out the pick right here and there and whatever, right? Now, the interesting part of this always was to me that, for instance, the last Overwatch League patch was basically the Brigitte patch with all those changes in mind of Brigitte, but without her. So how does that make sense in a universe where interdependencies, and keep in mind, if we're keeping up with this analogy, you're potentially introducing an apex predator into that ecosystem, right?
Yes.
Suddenly, Tracer is completely, obsolete on some maps at least, right? So how does that happen that you make balance changes, apparently with Brigitte in mind, have number tweaks and whatever, then have that patch be played in your premier competition, no tests whatsoever? I don't think that was actually ever played in contenders. Definitely wasn't on live service. So how does that work? How is this that you can have that ecosystem without that big character, as we know now, and deem that a balanced patch? It just doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, you could say, what if, there's a balance gap. It's actually not completely weighted and you balance completely, but it's fine if it's, going either direction a little bit more. So we have a window where it's a healthy metagame, right? And the exclusion of Brigitte was in that. Well, that's certainly the case, but how is it possible then that a character is then introduced onto competitive play? And I assume you're running Q&A on all of this, right? How is it possible that mere days, if I remember, was it under
like a day and a half before we knew what patch it was, right?
That was the one case, but also if they just packed it onto the ranked servers, people saw that it was ridiculously overpowered. Within a week, the Brigitte nerfs became live, and now that's not part of Overwatch League. So we're playing with that supposedly broken ecosystem. Yes. With a patch that has never been tested, because also currently Contenders is not going on, which I think is also contributing to the fact that people now need a longer time to figure it out. And coincidentally, this is quite interesting. I guess some teams in Contenders are already preparing because their competition stopped earlier than the Overwatch League on that specific patch. So they could already practice with Brigitte. So I wonder... I heard on Oversight that Timo said they were mostly practicing against Contenders teams. Now, maybe that's why they have an edge right now, because these Contenders teams were able to hone these Brigitte strategies before the Overwatch League teams had a feasible chance to get a crack at it. And that's why they are more on the meta. But this, by all means, shouldn't be the case. Everything, one for all, basically. One patch for competitive ranked, then... definitely open and Contenders as well as Overwatch League.
Yes. Because another factor is, when we think of the big patches over the years, the easiest examples to pick out are always going to be the ones where the meta, like I say, when it hits the sweet spot, it gets established, it becomes that almost every really top team has to play this one hero well. Now, there might be rare examples. I think an obvious rare example would be, to me, Lunatic High are the team that found bizarre counters or found a way around certain things, because obviously in eras when DPS was incredibly strong, they actually found success regardless, when I think most people would acknowledge they had some fairly whack DPS players, but they got around it. But then you think of, obviously when Ana came in, everyone was playing that. It was the only option pretty much. Later on, D.Va had a brief period where this could decide the whole game for you. This is some degree how Envious won an Apex championship, making what was basically an overnight substitution that instantly gave them a chance to become a champion. Later on, what would be Tracer not that long ago, basically for the first 2 or 3 stages of the Overwatch League, massively influential to the extent that basically, the only team that had any vague level of success with that was Houston Outlaws, probably. I think the only team I can think of that didn't have a world-class Tracer, and they're not, if anything, people said that was their limitation. Maybe they could have been a contender without that. So, certainly, with the way the Overwatch League particularly is being patched, if the idea was to tie this in again to some real teams and real examples, I think that's the best way to make the case to people. If you were tying this into the idea that, right, this is a sport, and your job as a sportsman is 2 things. 1, you want to get your personnel, who's on my team, and therefore I'm going to shape my team around who's on my team, except the difference is, unlike every sport I'm aware of, the terrain can change and the rules of the game can change. So, okay, the second component is, once I have my personnel, I know who they are, I know what their strengths are, I got to fit them as best I can to the world that we're going into, this terrain of what's strong, how things are played, what styles we can play. And from that, yes, I can see a lot of room there for great coaching, for players to figure out their roles differently. But my main issue, I think, would be to tie into that aspect of you must be very good at this thing, is no coach can actually plan for that, and no GM can even do that. In the NBA, I really can pick the players I want to sign on the basis of what type of squad do I have, what style do we like, what sort of player would be the best star for my squad, So sometimes I might go with an unusual one. Maybe I'll choose a power forward as my favorite player, my star player rather, based on the sort of squad I have. Maybe I have a lot of 3-point shooters. He's going to get a lot of rebounds, whatever it might be. The problem is I can't build a team like that and then tomorrow be told something bizarre the backboard's 2 feet higher and the rebounds come off differently and 3-point shots aren't as effective. If I hear this, I'll do my best. Yeah, I will try to adapt. And yes, my players will understand that maybe the power forward isn't as featured anymore, but we're just not going to be as good a team. So how do you weigh that up? Because it's something that does torture me a little bit, because I have to do it myself. If I'm talking week to week, I can't say all these pieces of context. I have to say, no, this team is doing quite poorly now and they're probably not going to win. So what do you think to this aspect? And can you kind of tie it to some examples that come to mind for you from Overwatch League specifically, so we can keep people within the game, not too abstract where, yes, people like you and I may like to float away to, but some people like to be grounded.
Yeah, so definitely, if we start out a little bit before Overwatch League, it was like the Lucio changes came in, where you suddenly had to do more than just shot calling, basically, and stand on the payload or boost characters in. I mean, some people were doing more stuff at the time, but it wasn't really as cost-effective, I guess I would say, in terms of giving up your own computational power in your brain to make the shot calls, right? So when that change hit, a bunch of teams let go of their Lucios. I remember it was Wins, it was I forget the name. It was a Fnatic player.
Yes, it's the one that they replaced with Cooler for
Vonethil.
Winter, right? So who was it? Yes, Vonethil.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And like this basically eradicated him or made their specific skill set very different. Now there's even an argument to be made that when the Mercy meta came in, maybe these people would have been attractive to Overwatch League teams again. But in the advertisement stage, where people had to sort of suggest themselves to Overwatch League teams, that wasn't necessarily a skill set that was sought after. So how does an Overwatch League team prepare? How does a player prepare to that, right? Like, continuing that is the same with Ana. Like last year, maybe around this time last year, I think a lot of people would still have said Wu Jihong is the best player in the game, isn't he?
Yes.
And the best Western player is maybe Chipsayan or Anko or whatever.
Well, if you go back even further, if you remember, one of the early guests we had on Oversight was Dummy from NRG, and he actually looked like one of the better Ana players. He was pretty clutch with his sleep darts. Now, that's a name that people who only watch Overwatch League are going to be, who the fuck is that? I've never heard of him, because he's not relevant. He is in no way, doesn't even look like he's ever going to be back on the radar as an Overwatch player. So this has quite starkly decided people's careers.
Yeah, and it's. I'm sure there's some decay. There's always like the first pros in every esport, right? And they get phased out by more, possibly mechanical or just better players over the time, just because of her. But I'm not convinced that this is actually, especially the case for Chipsayan and Wu Jihong. Now the question is also, we've already heard that, I'm sure. I think I read some translation that wasn't meant to be as serious. But when Wu Jihong says he's not sure if he's making it to season 2, what if Ana becomes meta again? Like, do we trust his current performance that he wouldn't immediately be a top 5 player in the world on this role? I don't think that's actually likely that this is happening to him. So I don't know. It's super weird, and this sort of ties to I'm not to go too far with this, and I think my webcam is flipped, but basically. There is a thing in neuroscience, or I guess it's also part of it would have to be neuroscience and sports science in general. There's a thing called a special skill, and what they tested was, because a special skill formerly was only a thing that was something for gross motor skills, but even as the study. And I will probably post it as a comment in the comment section. This study proved is that even in sports like archery, where the finer motor skills are more required, is that at a specific point, which tends to be the tournament range, people peak. So it's like a graph like this, and you can't really see it that well, but like it's like, okay, so
yes, okay. People
go like, okay, this is the score they hit. Yeah. And then at 18 meters, it peaks and then drops down, right?
So that's like the effective range or something.
Yeah, that's the effective range, which all the tournaments usually are held at. So 18 meters for archery. If you go outside of that, people, even if you go nearer, they are significantly worse at that range. And if you go further away, there's even more bad at that range, right?
Okay.
Because they've trained themselves to be in that specific distance and then achieve there. And that's both a thing of, I guess, selecting people that are very good at this, and also people practicing that specific skill for possibly years, right? To aim at 18 meters with bow and arrow.
Okay.
Now, if we translate this to Tracer players, for instance, which I think is a pretty good example, I think maybe for a year, maybe a year and a half, Tracer has been relevant in the Overwatch meta, and suddenly she's much less played now. And I think that to a degree, even the level or the pick rate we're seeing now is already still exaggerated, because as more teams pick up Brigitte, her pick rate will drop down even more. So what does that do to players like Striker, like you mentioned before? Now he has one other pick that he's shown in Overwatch League so far. I think it's only Junkrat. And other than that, either he, through like just overwhelming skill, makes it work somehow, which sometimes happens also in Overwatch, but it's an uphill battle, isn't it? So what he would need to learn is to master another character at that level in order to keep his job, basically, right? So how is that... How is that a nice thing? Like, okay, so here's a scenario, right? Like, everyone has been at a urinal, right? So imagine if someone put a treadmill while you're pissing, and the treadmill would drive you back, and you now would have to learn to aim like that while walking, right? So it's not just that. If we're drawing an accurate comparison to how it is to play Tracer now, it's if you get too close, a wall shoots up and you piss yourself. That's basically what's playing Tracer right now is, right? So it's a completely problematic situation, because this might theoretically impact pro player careers, because what if Striker completely bombs out of playoffs? Is he likely to be signed for the next year again? I mean, we don't know what the off season will entail, but a large part of it is going to be the World Cup stuff. What if he's not brought on there and he can't advertise himself there? What does that do to pro player careers?
Because here's the thing with that, like, what'll seem very weird is, like, first of all, I will say one element to Overwatch League that is very promising, in contrast to League of Legends, for example, is that in League of Legends, they have not, to this day, been able to implement substitutes in the way that the Overwatch League has. Actually, I think that it's probably one of the most underrated good aspects, I think, of the Overwatch League is how successful substituting has been. Now, admittedly, it's partly because you have different game types and different maps, and therefore then you have the specialists, you know. So, okay, you could make a case, okay, maybe Striker can have a career like Snillo did towards the end of the Fusion, where it's like, right, you are the Tracer specialist, and if Tracer's viable, we'll bring you in, or we'll bring you in for this map that we're going to use it on, but you know, you won't be a starter. Okay, you could maybe make an argument like that to temper this issue. But first of all, the very fact that he was being called one of the best players in the Overwatch League for playing one hero tells you that adaptability was not even a factor for him. He did not wake up one day and say, right, I used to play this totally other hero. You know, I used to be the best McCree, and now I've got to change and become the best Tracer. Because remember, if that principle existed, that the best teams and best players adapt, then what would happen is the best McCree player, the best Soldier player would switch. He'd switch to Tracer. He would become the best Tracer player, and therefore that variable is a fair variable that does work that way, and there's nothing arbitrary about it. Because that's the scary part if you're a fan of the competitive side, is you don't want it to be arbitrary. You don't want someone to wake up one day and suddenly, oh, sorry, Maradona, there's just no dribbling left in football. Like, that's just gone for you, mate. It's just all passing and, you know, set pieces. Like, you know, that would be terrible, obviously, if you're a fan of football. But you can expand it to beyond that, because someone might say, well, yeah, well, maybe Tracer was just a raw example. First of all, that's a bad thing in itself. If it is that we find out tomorrow that Striker can only ever be like a slightly sub Overwatch League level player at every other hero, that tells you something about the way the game's balanced right now, that there was a hero that he could only play and he was never exposed. There was no aspect. I mean, obviously, you can throw in that there's no bans in this game. It's not like League of Legends where I could ban your thing that you were one trick on. That doesn't exist. But there's the other aspect, which is you look at teams, and again, this clearly exists for teams. I mean, the two most ridiculous examples, to keep it in stage 4 for people watching now, have to be Boston Uprising, because they were running this one style, they ran it so well. Now, yes, if you can execute something perfectly, to some degree in any game or sport, you can do it all the time. That's the concept of execution. But the idea that meta changes just pull the entire arse out your entire org. Remember, they're a team that has subs. They have multiple different players. The whole thing about their squad was they weren't relying on one player. Like, yes, Striker was a linchpin piece, but you know what? Dreamcast was pretty fucking great with his versatility. Gamsa was a key piece. They actually had, they were exactly what I would want to advertise the Overwatch League as. Like, look, someone made a team. These are pieces that fit together and they were coached well. If they suddenly drop off to nothing, if you want to believe that this is a reasonable scenario, you have to believe that. I mean, we used to have a joke in League of Legends. Monty used to say on Summoning Insight, it was called the Skill Vampires. You have to believe that the Skill Vampires broke into the Boston Uprising house before the first week of Stage 4, drained every motherfucker in there of his skill, and that's why they're just not as good. It's not that the game balance is flawed or the game itself. Then the other obvious example is Dallas Fuel. I know people want to believe, again, they want this to be easy, right? It's simple. What happened was, Effect was just too stressed. He went to Korea. The other guys knew there was no pressure on them for Stage 4. They got a new coach, and they really like this coach. They work on, like, that's a great story. But you know what? If you don't make the meta switch, they're not fucking one of the top teams. They're probably winning a couple more games. I'll give them that, but they're definitely not going to be one of the best teams in the league. Doesn't, all that other stuff could exist. It could all be true even. It could all be a factor on some lower level. But I don't think you see this like reversal of fortune with the two squads, especially as the reason why they're great examples is because they're such extremes in terms of how they were well managed. Remember, Dallas Fuel would be the poster boy for how not to run an Overwatch League franchise. So it just shows how extreme. Now, it's not going to be like that all the time, but for me, that does say something a bit concerning at the very minimum.
Yeah, and it's also just how whack is it that we now can't say or have any indicator, is it actually that Aero is a very good coach? Is it actually that Boston was maybe...
Was Krusty the best coach?
Exactly.
Can't really know.
Now, Shock is looking better, so we have to have way more sample size in order to say that a coach is very impactful.
And remember, just as a quick aside, the other sick thing is, like, forget us. The teams themselves can't even know that entirely, They're going to have to hope and they're going to have to buy into it, but... They can't really know. Like, if I'm the general manager, dude, I'm like, fuck, did I make the right call there? Would the team have gotten worse anyway? Would this team have improved it? I can't know.
I mean, just that should tell you everything about the impact of patches on the level of play. Boston Uprising was the strongest looking team in an entire stage after the Black Swan event, something that is so horrific that it's shy of basically having a plane crash and having all their players unable to play or dead. Like this, it seems to be a lesser issue for them than a meta switch. How ridiculous is that, right? So patches is maybe that also says something about the strength of patches. Maybe they are overtuning certain aspects way too much. So, I mean, it's always going to be hard to have new heroes introduced, but the fact that we usually had to have, even with Anna, we had to have like 2 months before Overwatch teams, pro teams, the best teams in the world, would even touch a character. The fact that she's now in should tell you everything about how incredibly overtuned she is. Like, we're currently trying to figure out how to call these comps. So technically, we would have to say they are running triple support. Well, that's not true, actually. Like, I personally argue that she's much more of a tank than she's a support. Or do you have to reinvent a completely other archetype? So you can only really assess that once they tune down these obviously ridiculous numbers. Now, the fact that we are playing on a patch which we all know is overpowered because it already has been pretty much confirmed by Blizzard by them nerfing it on live servers is... I mean, I have all the sympathies for the fact that it's very hard to make it work on the LAN client and whatever, right? And bugs, like, for instance, yesterday we had a situation where we haven't heard from the engineers back, but it looks like that Fissure should have hit an Earth Shatter onto in the battle for Los Angeles because Fate was in the air, and the Earth Shatter should have hit everyone behind it, and I think it was 2 or 3 players, that would have likely resulted in a wipe. But for some reason, either it's a visual bug of the spectator client, which I don't think can be the case, but the Shatter didn't hit. So that bug was game-changing and would have resulted in a tie, I believe. Now, of course, if these bugs happen because you didn't have time to balance for or introduce these balance patches, or for instance, the new hands-on mechanics, and makes them feasible for the new patch and also for the LAN client, then that makes sense to me. But there needs to be better communication between the Overwatch League team and the dev team, so these things don't happen anymore for several reasons. Just, for the viewers, it's bad. It's bad for even if you introduce this, then you have way too many bugs. It's so problematic that I think you could even make an argument that maybe not even every stage you should introduce patches, but maybe even just every second patch. And also keep in mind that further actually helps you, because down the line, if you're thinking of after Overwatch League season, and I'm sure, of course, we're all in Overwatch League mode, but what's after? Like there's a significant dip in attention where also maybe players will play less because you don't have them coming in for Overwatch League reasons, like being motivated to play Layla because they saw their favorite player. So what you can do is go radical with the patches and maybe introduce more characters at once or something, right? Just to keep the attention up. So I think the dev team needs to realize that Overwatch League is a big enough draw, if it is. I actually don't know for sure if that's that significant. But if they decide it is, and it actually probably needs to be for the league to be successful in the future, I think they need to realize that their attention span dip is nothing like it was before we had the Overwatch League. It's not that we can play tournaments around it, and there is this novelty peak and then it bottoms out at some point. We are creating special novelty through Overwatch League, through stage finals, even though it's not happening as well, but that's also on the format. But if you can then take these excitement peaks and work them into your dev cycles, I think that makes the job of the devs a lot easier, and also just makes it better for competitive integrity as a whole.
Yeah, one of the problems I see with this, unfortunately, is again the fact that are you balancing for the casual or are you balancing for the person who's the pro player? And unfortunately, like, first of all, I definitely agree that from these two games, which I've pointed out to me have the most problems with patching and balancing, which is League of Legends and Overwatch, it was not only clear that they balanced for the casual player in as much as, like famously what they'll do is there'll be a high mechanical or high like decision-making hero that will get a buff when it was already like decent in, usually it's that it was terrible in solo queue, which is why it gets the buff. But the problem is in pro play, because it's high mechanical or its key decision-making was already good enough, it could already be played, and therefore the buff puts it so out of control, it's like ridiculous. And so the numbers get to where they want it to be in the casual, and it ruins the pro player. Vice versa, you have something in pro player that obviously ends up getting like it's a similar scenario, but it goes vice versa out of pro player. Now the problem with this is the cynical part of me knows for a fact in League of Legends, for example, that a reason they do this is they don't want the most casual player to get bored with the game, whether it's balanced or not. Like, they want to have a turnover of heroes and champions. So they want something that was never played to be played. Now, the problem with that, this is where it gets really tricky, is there's a difference, in my opinion, between tweaking something like, I want to make this thing viable in some sense, and me saying, I'm going to make sure this is played. Reverse engineering that a hero or champion will be played seems almost guaranteed to wreck the whole meta, because you're not then thinking as much about what's the knock-on effect. For example, in pro play in these two games, the killer as well is what is a comp. Because these comps will never be run in casual play, or if they are, you will never have the level of coordination. Like, for example, think about how many amazing Winston Traces we saw over Stage 2 and Stage 3. You just don't get those in solo queue. It'll never exist that way. So as a result, you know what? Someone might be able to play like Reaper into it in a way that would never work at the pro level, but seems fine. Now this seems balanced. Reaper's fine in casual play. Obviously, in League of Legends, there's a whole bunch of heroes that can only basically be broken. So, like, I'm thinking of, like, Zed, Yasuo. They can seemingly only be busted as fuck in solo queue or unplayable in solo queue because they have such solo play, carry play, that either in team play they get totally shut down, they can't be viable at all, or they then just become OP as fucking pro play. So, you get this scenario where I don't blame the dev entirely. So, on that level, it's like, you kind of have to almost get a wink and a nudge from the dev. Like, if your real business, as you're kind of alluding to here, isn't the esports side, you've got to sort of give me a wink and a nudge so that I'm like, right, well, I won't keep complaining about this because I know you're not really balancing for pro play. But if you are really, if, as you're saying, the attention is there, the model is there, that the casual side has to basically share, it has to compromise with the pro level of play, then we can have this discussion, which is what you alluded to, which is how do you patch? Because one of the biggest problems is, if you want the turnover of champions, you want 5 champions that were being played all the time for 2 years to go out of the meta, you want 5 that were never played to come into the meta, obviously the numbers would be lower for Overwatch, I'd say maybe 1 or 2, then you're going to make drastic changes. And when you buff something, it's not going to be, I buff his damage 5, and we'll see what that does. It's going to be, I'll buff his damage 20, and you know what? Someone who was being effective against him, I minus him 10 health or 10 armor or whatever it might be, and I make sure that it's a radical change. And the problem then is, even those 2 changes are big, but there's going to be knock-on changes I can never know that are going to be even more radical. It's going to be like a mass. It's going to like throwing a stone in a pond. Even once the stone's gone, the ripple is going to be pretty big, and it's going to take a while till it goes all the way out. Now, the issue there is, I would personally say, if you wanted to tweak the game, tweak it. Don't buff on up. Just a little one here on one thing. Let that lie. Let that see how it goes. Again, you wouldn't literally just look at one match and Overwatch. Yeah, you look at all the data. Let's see how that tweak worked. Right now, we tweak another thing over here. I mean, this is the way any scientist would work. Obviously, you'd want to control for a variable. The problem is, as far as I can tell, all these games, Overwatch included, tend to buff and nerf all at once. And I don't care what they do with the PBE type environment. They never really know what the effect's going to be. And so this will always cause a problem as far as I can tell at esports, sometimes radically so.
Yeah, it's just also, if like I come from like way back in the day, I was into WoW Arena, and we had pretty big problems with balance there too. But then
I know in that game, by the way, just as a quick aside, because SK Gaming, the team I used to work for, had players in that game, I actually knew some of them, was friends with some of the best players in the world in WoW. And one of them, for example, told me that he was like the best healer in the entire world. And then basically like a patch came in and his team just like couldn't win. And then vice versa, like there was some guy who was like the best warrior, and then they nerfed the warrior as well. And they were like, right, well, you know, in this tournament, like we did amazing to finish 3rd, for example. And that's not what you want to hear if someone is the best in the entire world.
No, that's definitely true. It was also basically bound on this special skill scenario because, yes, surely players could have picked up other characters, but they weren't as good. And WoW was basically only a high cognitive game. And it wasn't so much about mechanics as it was about, you know, absorbing,
it's like understanding interactions or something, right?
Yeah, absorbing a ton of information, making decisions based on that. So, no, but we had pretty big problems. But it became better when the first tier of top players, I would say, actually phased out of the scene, but then were picked up as Q&A. And
right,
for instance, like Natrana comes to mind, who was basically winning all the MLGs back then, and then came to the Q&A team, and that kept going on basically over the years, where they would continuously absorb top players for Q&A, and that can't be the case for Overwatch, obviously. For like, to be fair,
I believe, by the way, it was a similar scenario in Magic the Gathering. I believe Magic the Gathering actually ended up, a lot of the like designers and balance people came from like the first like great champions who were like world champions and stuff. That's what they transitioned into as a career.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite obvious that the testing is not where it should be. And you can't expect Overwatch League teams to specifically keep an eye out and inform you because their schedule's already overloaded. You maybe can ask coaches. I know for a fact that Blizzard has calls with player representatives every once in a while, and I assume balance is brought up there. So they try, and then in certain scenarios, there are certain balance patches where everyone's like, well, it was so obvious that this was going to be overpowered. And Blizzard comes out and says, well, we got 2 emails about it, right? Well, we got no feedback on that. So that's definitely also a thing where the community can improve on. But for instance, why would you not maybe approach someone like a Wins? If he's up for it, I'm not sure if he wants to do it full time, but surely he could be working for you as a consultant on new changes, right? Or overall improve the quality of your PTR, because nobody actually goes to the PTR to really test for the intricacies. They go like, oh, this is new. I want to have the new thing before it hits live service, and so see what I can expect from that specific hero, and then the tension goes down quickly because there's actually really not that much in there, right? So you need to create some incentive structures in order for people to keep playing PTR. So these massively overtuned characters never actually hit the live service, such as Hanzo and Brigitte. So things you could be doing is at least transfer the playtime you have on PTR to the main account. Like, you're currently not even giving cosmetics for the time you're playing there. So that's a massive turnoff. Maybe, like, I would argue, whatever time it takes to transfer that, it's probably worth it in terms of how much quality testing you get out of that. And then maybe you give forum privileges, or, I don't know, Overwatch League points, or whatever, like loot boxes, or run small tournaments or challenges for small ladders or whatever. Just make something that makes the PTR attractive enough to maybe not, take all the attention from the live service, but introduce more player base so you have actual data to work with. Because this, like, I can't see how Blizzard would have let Brigitte in the first incarnation live if they had credible data. She's currently complete as she was introduced. I mean, think about this. Someone picked a character, went into their rank game, and won something like, the average player won like 60 to 65% of their matches.
And remember, this is where they have, by definition, minimal competence at this thing versus people who presumably are playing things that they've played for a year.
Yeah. I mean, surely there's the argument to be made that you also need to learn to play against Brigitte, and therefore you then become... Maybe you can, outweigh some of it, but it surely doesn't outweigh the fact that people first need to learn the character, right? So
yes,
this
is why win rate will always be a very kind of a somewhat misleading way to balance something.
Yes, I mean, also just people argue with pick rate a lot, and for me, like there are scenarios where a character is picked every single time, and that's not unhealthy. I think that actually, for instance, D.Va for the longest time could have been the gatekeeper for a lot of stupid stuff. She was very skillful. There's nothing unhealthy inherently about her.
No. I mean, there's examples in every game as a fact. Like, for example, in League of Legends, I think even to this day, I don't know if there's ever been a meta in which you couldn't pick Orianna as a mid laner. And that was just because the kit was fantastic, basically. So the point is, as a pro player... Like, first of all, always had like an okay lane. So now here's the point. It could be picked all the time, but that never meant it was the best. In fact, oftentimes it was not the best. You picked it for what it did and the fact that it wasn't the worst. So actually, if anything, it was probably a very well-balanced hero. Or champion in that particular case. Right, okay, here's one aspect that I would say to this, okay, which is to like flesh out the idea a little bit. If I give examples, right, I already know immediately what people are going to do because this has happened to me in every game I've ever covered, which is, okay, so if we were talking about League of Legends, if I was to say, for example, this particular role is like limited or it's got too much of this, someone would say, yeah, but Faker, and I always say, the first thing you do in any reasonable discussion is exclude extreme outliers. So the one player who's like far and away the best player of all time and has defied all expectations of even really great players should obviously be excluded for this conversation. In fact, if anything, you want to go into the heart of pros. You want to get a big bell curve of pros and go, oh, right, look where, like, the 80% is. That's right deep in the curve. That's who we want to look at. We don't want to, like, what you never do, as my boy NN Taleb would tell you, is you don't look at the very end of the curve where the tail goes off and go, look, if he exists, it must all be fine. It's like, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. So, likewise, I already know there's going to be someone, Yiska, who goes, wait a minute, you were saying it can change the fortunes. Have you ever heard of this team called the New York Excelsior? I made as good an effort as I could in the first 2 stages of Overwatch to always point out what a fucking joke the luxury of the players the New York Excelsior had was. Because if you remember in the first stage, for example, you know what? Libero actually used to have some dodgy games. He used to have some shaky games where he didn't look like he was even going to be always the person in the game. He then, by about stage 3, was one of the best players in the entire fucking league and like potential MVP. So the point is, if anything, the reason their team was adaptable and versatile was like they had the outliers not just in terms of Jonak, the best player, which no one can emulate, but they had all these luxuries. They basically had the equivalent of the dude sitting back, where it's like, if the meta ever switches, just bring me in and I'll be the best at whatever the new aspect is. So and obviously they've only had 4 stages. For all we know, in season 2, they could have their own stage where magically the rug is pulled out from under them. I mean, the obvious scenario would be somehow something happens to Jonak. I mean, that would probably be the thing that would pull apart the entire mechanism. But go beyond them, because to take New York Excelsior out for a moment, there are very few players, even in the Korean teams, which had fabulous talents, who legitimately were world-class at, like, 2 or more heroes. Most of them, even, the Birdrings, they were good at, like, 2. Like, there was 2 that were really world-class at. If at a press, they can play a third, or they can do something else if someone else is going to feature in the offense, There weren't many. And so, to me, if the best players in the world are at that level of cap, that's part of the problem, because when I think of pre-Overwatch, we could actually avoid all this discussion. We could go, you know what, look at Siegel, look at Tavik, look at Taimu. These guys can go wherever they need to. I mean, I did an interview recently with Taimu, which still hasn't come out, where he still in his mind thinks he was good at like 5 heroes. It's like, come on, mate. In what universe were you among the best at 5 heroes? Like, either at the very limited point in the game, or you just didn't have an Overwatch league where you'd have had to play the 4th of those heroes, 3 times in a row when the opponent knows you're going to play it, So I do feel as though the whole league points to this being an issue, because when I try to, like, extrapolate forwards, if I'm a GM, I would have to be incredibly cynical and go, right, you know what? Fuck the world of star players. What I'm going to have to do is, I've got 12 slots on my team. I'm going to literally have a pretty good Tracer player. I'm going to have like a Winston / Reinhardt type player who's vaguely capable on both. I'm going to have like the off tank. I'm going to have some of that. I'll have a sub for both. I'm going to have to probably make it so that like I can't have a full rotation with DPS, because I've got to have enough subs that could play the other ones. Again, with the healing things, they've tended to be pretty hard swaps at times. I'm going to have one of each, I would have to go into a world, and for anyone saying, okay, cool, maybe that's the business, that would suck to watch, because you'd be in a world where there is no LeBron. There's a dude who comes in to play this map, this mode, and for this stage, and another dude sits on the bench the whole time. Like, by the way, Snillo will now. And as far as we can tell, if you'd have brought Snillo in stage 2 and made him a starter for someone as a Tracer, he may well be one of the stars of the league right now. Now, you're barely going to see him in the game. So that concerns me, because I actually feel like even the adaptation to that in terms of how you make your team probably isn't that great to watch. Like, I get the feeling fans do want to watch the star player, and they want to see what he does on a new hero and how he can adapt. That would be a fun story, I feel like.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, a little bit of it is also the social component of it, which we've seen, where it looks to be, at least in the current climate, it's like you basically don't even want to fill up your squad as to 12 players, because then, if they have some sort of quality, they obviously want to play at some point.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to get that guy to sit on the bench and go, yeah, cool, my hero just isn't in the meta at the moment. I'll sit on this bench and do nothing.
Like, literally introducing Flower into New York Excelsior right now. Let's assume he had like a birthday a month prior and he would have been eligible for the season. That has a potential to actually make them worse in a sense, just because of how the social components seem to work. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of it that maybe New York Excelsior just has this figured out, and they also, I mean, they keep rotating, and if we're being honest, I have this feeling that come start stage 3, they were already cruising. They already knew that they were very likely to make overall playoffs. They were rarely going hard. Most definitely, currently, they're not playing to their full potential, and only ever switch to the real comms when they really care and go off dive, whatever, and they're completely styling on people. I think, in a sense, NYXL actually keeps us from seeing these patches as the big problem as they are, because
they don't try to abuse it.
Yeah, they don't try to abuse it, and they are just so above and beyond everyone else that we don't see these constant switches. Because if we go in a tier down, like, Sideshow argued against me that Philadelphia Fusion has the most potential in the Overwatch League. Well, look, did that look like it in stage 3? Like, that was obviously also not just a meta thing, but also, internal struggle, which might be also exacerbated by patch changes. Because, like, I had a concept before the Overwatch League, which was the core of 4, basically, what I called it. So the core of 4 was never had a team that had a core of 4 starting players won a tournament under 100 days. So you need 100 days in order to build this core 4 that has then a synergy, and then only then they are able to bring peak performances. Now, this has changed maybe a little bit also through superior coaching, I would say, in Overwatch League, and coaches learn a lot more what goes into being a successful team and whatnot. But it's still probably 3 players that you basically want to have almost 100% play rate, unless you're playing Shanghai or someone. And what if one of those core players, or even worse, what if 2 of your core players just don't work in that meta? Now you're coming from a top tier team possibly to a mid tier team, or even low mid tier team. Right, so it's way too volatile. If you're looking through the rotation, so we had Houston being very good in stage 1. We had Philly who peaked once. We had Boston who peaked. Valiant
towards the end of last stage coming into this one, yeah.
Exactly. LAG is interesting for this stage. Definitely now Dallas is coming from nowhere suddenly making it.
And by the way, the Gladiators won as much as this is not a cop-out, but I feel like they got something of an outlier themselves with Fischer, because not only was he fantastic at something which has remained meta, but he shot calls on top of it. So he is something of an outlier for a Western team, put that way.
Yeah, and it would be a way better and compelling story. Now, with Fischer, we fortunately got this, and we can see that he's a great player. Now, imagine a situation where Fischer comes in, and there's a meta switch, and LAG goes off like they did. Now we don't know if it's Fischer or the meta switch, right? And that really lessens the experience of it all. And I don't know, I find it so unsatisfying that we can't say, is Arrow a good coach? Is Kai maybe not as good of a coach? Like these situations are currently entirely explainable by meta switches, right?
Is Seagull a great teammate? Is he making good calls in the game? Yeah,
stuff like that. Or definitely Krusty, who a lot of people have in hold in high regards, especially on site. So the Overwatch League analysts, I assume they talk to him, and we basically have to trust them. I did a video, I think somewhere last year in January, sort of foretelling that the coaches in Overwatch League would become stars. At least a couple of them would. Now, these situations, this might have happened earlier if we had these very clear indicators that certain coaches are just phenomenal, and then obviously they would have to work out a little bit on their personality, which, for instance, I guess we can sort of assume this of Wizardyoung at this point. And he's also making moves in that direction where he also gets his personality a little bit more out there. So I hope we can just think of Wizardyoung in the same sense we can think of Jonak, at least come next season, when we have clearer signals of how important Overwatch League coaches actually are.
Yes. Another factor I wanted to throw in, actually, as like a side tangent factor, but we can do this as we start to like close the topic to some degree, was the other reason why I don't think there's like I'm not saying there's any solutions to this. The whole point is it's a chaotic scenario, and you're just trying to find, I mean, here's the irony, Blizzard developers. You must be adaptable. You must be versatile. You must change your strategy over time. That's why it's a tough situation for anyone. And as much as it's very easy to criticize when there are blatant problems, doesn't mean there's a solution. But another aspect that I wanted to throw in is every time I try and think of a fix that basically we could do without Blizzard. So, for example, have better subs, or maybe when you construct a team, like maybe you even have to construct it in a way where it's like, you have to pick the star player that's the least volatile in terms of what would happen if there was a hard there's all these things you could do in theory, which to be fair, they do in other sports. It's just there's less variables that go crazy. But the part that I actually see as the most worrying has to be, because I'm thinking of the Rio de Hong here, is what happens if you have the subs and you have the team and you have the players who could adapt, but the player I have to take out to do it is my shot caller. And even worse, he's the iconic shot caller. I mean, we already saw that probably the best example of this was where Miro reinvented how you play Winston. And he was objectively on all possible metrics, eye tests, stats, wins. He was the better Winston. But if you take him out, they'll have a better Winston, but will they win the game? Now, that's the problem. And that was always going to be Lunatic Highs and the Seoul Dynasty's challenge, is that they themselves couldn't find the perfect solution to that, and they tried to train other people up. And by the way, that in itself gets into a whole other can of worms, which again, fans love truisms, and one of their truisms is like, well, just train someone to be a better shot caller. It's like, that's like saying, why didn't Alexander the Great just tell one of his generals how to be the next great leader of the world when he was about to die? It's like, some people have special qualities. Some people can have special qualities drawn out of them. Some people just don't, and will never really have a great way of telling who's who, except if they can do it. So the shot calling one has also been something which has proven to be, I think, fairly instrumental in Overwatch League. It's just actually, funnily enough, to tie into what you said about Fischer, is because tank, especially Winston, became so key. I actually think initially we didn't really know that it was the shot calling that was a massive part of the Gladiator switch too. It looked like getting a super competent Winston was the first thing they got.
Yeah, and it's in all other esports before, I always thought it was a whack way of saying, like, a very convenient excuse for players who would always go on social media and go like, "Oh, our team play today wasn't on point," when it obviously was also the individual performance that you just weren't clicking heads as well. Now, Overwatch, I think, actually is a completely different beast than most other esports titles, where it's 80% teamwork and then 20% skill, and only in very few instances do you actually have a player take over the game. And that's why, like, outliers like a Jonak are so marvelous, because he basically does it so frequently, right? So this is something, he needs to be so good, so unheard of good, in order to impact the way NYXL is playing the game, protect the Jonak or whatever, dealing so much damage that it basically usually doesn't work like that in Overwatch. And there are peak performances, I guess, the battle for Los Angeles, I guess, LAV against LAG. I guess it was it last night? Yeah, I didn't get to see it yet. I think people were saying that soon was popping off. I mean, yes, there are scenarios where overperformances can turn a game around, but this is basically only ever if the 80% are already fulfilled, if the teamwork is already there. And
well, the key example would be just go watch Sire player in every Florida Mayhem game. I mean, he's doing what basically you would want Soon, Fletter, these Birdring to do, but it doesn't matter because the team isn't there. I mean, that's always going to be the reason why this is one of the reasons I actually think Overwatch could be a brilliant esport if it keeps going, is because it's combined the two worlds. FPS is amazing for this reason. You can have a hero player who goes above and beyond. Now, yes, you need the team component. You can't win with just one great player in Counter-Strike either. But if you have a decent enough, it's basically, can the team hold him back enough to make this one great player lose the game? If it can't, he can win the game. But the skill, as a result, will also limit the amount of strategy and factors you can do, because then more skilled players can limit whether your strategy works. You might do the right thing against them but lose. In games like League of Legends, it's obvious that the mechanical ceiling is not as high. Doesn't mean everyone hits it, but it's not as high, and it definitely doesn't have as much of an impact on the game. So then understanding of the meta, comps becomes a massive factor in winning the game, and you can have worse players overall win the game against better players. I think for me, Overwatch, if it does it right, can be the one that will sort of marry the two the most perfectly.
Yeah, definitely also depending on what kind of new characters we get, because I guess for the most part, other than Brigitte, I think the new introductions were mostly at least a little bit of a step up in terms of mechanical skill that was required to play them. And most workovers also go in that direction, where Hanzo is arguably now, I guess, there's more of a skill ceiling now, I would argue. That if the Symmetra changes go live as suggested, that is also the case. Orisa is definitely probably the more mechanically, at least from an aim perspective, now that we found out what actually entails playing Winston well mechanically, I guess Winston's a little bit harder still, but
what about this then? Because the direction you're leading in here is actually a great final topic. So basically, you notice I always kept drawing the comparison to League of Legends there, because first of all, a lot of people who've played Overwatch at least have some knowledge of League of Legends and the concept. And unfortunately, if you only know MOBAs generally and you've never played Dota 2, it's just such a radically different game. You can't sort of draw the same hard and fast rules. But one of the things, just as a layman who enjoys watching Dota, one of the reasons I enjoy watching it actually as an esport is that I think it's one of the best I've ever seen at what I call like sort of like get out of jail free balance, which is what you do is definitely there are things that are super OP, and you have certain hero picks in Dota, which if they get in a game and the right player has them, he'll take over the game, he'll win the game for you, and he'll ruin the game. Now, yes, they have bans, but even so, there's so many heroes, they can play in so many roles, sometimes you can't avoid some of these basically like superpower picks getting into the game. But what I will say is, they tend not to like hard nerf as much, and they tend to make it so that like everything has some degree of viability. Now, the reason why that's good is, yes, in solo queue, it doesn't matter. People are going to pick the super OP shit, they're going to wreck the game, and you're going to think, oh, this sucks, deal with it. And it will be dealt with in time in balancing, right? But what's good is, when you get to the pro level, what you basically did with Brood War and Counter-Strike, like I said in the past, was luckily you just gave the artists a brilliant palette. So you never needed to make a new color because they had such a brilliant palette anyway. They could make so many different styles of art and different drawings and detail. And obviously, yeah, they worked on their ability to do fine artwork and they constructed new concepts of art. But the difference is, if you just give pro players a really wide toolkit or palette, as it were, they'll then find solutions to the super OP shit themselves. It won't have to absolutely be nerfed out of oblivion. So I know that's easier said than done, but I do feel like that's also somewhere that I think probably Overwatch should head more towards, as opposed to working in a world where we nerf things a lot so everything seems even. Make things quite powerful, because actually then, for example, even some of the outlier players will do amazing shit. They'll take a hero, as you're saying, maybe strike it if Tracer had a little bit more viability, maybe he'd make it work no matter what, and they'd be the one team running something counter to the entire meta that everyone else was doing. But then we'd all be knowing what a godlike player him and the team is, because we go, that's not supposed to work, how are you doing that? So I think in general, it's a very vague concept. I don't blame someone for not having the specifics, but that would be more the direction I'd prefer to head in, because it's with the principle of the players will kind of decide the balance, as it were.
Yeah, that's basically, that's why I like the Symmetra change so much, because basically what it does now, or as it is advertised, is like the teleporter is a normal ability, and it lets you place them wherever, and then also place the exit wherever. And that's obviously something that has so much creative potential, where what you could basically do, which we only ever saw, and I would argue even less, a little bit less, with May, right? Where they had the wall boosts, especially for Meta Athena, where they tried to break maps in certain ways. And I think if we add this, and funnily enough, the example that comes to mind was Minecraft was once a very basic game, and what they just built in was continuously adding more logic blocks, and then it became something where you could basically do everything in there. You can basically create a PC or a calculator in there, or whatever you want, right? And if you keep adding these logic blocks into champion toolkits, I think that just, snowballs the complexity of the game, and it will also be a lot more creative, a lot more exciting, and also the novelty will come with it.
Also, to me, another part of the philosophy, which again, unfortunately, if you are cynically balancing for the casual side, you're not going to do this. You're just going to flat out ignore this philosophy, which is that. So, okay, you remember there was an episode of Oversight where I made a joke like this. Like, to me, the way that I would have fixed Mercy is, no, I wouldn't nerf her or buff some other shit so she's not played. What I would have done was, if you really think Mercy Res is overpowered, make it so it's exactly the same now, but there's some extra component to it. So my joke was I would make it a rhythm game. Like, you'd have to do like 4-2-4, 4-4, 1-2-3-3. And it's like, if you only hit 70%, you only get 70% heal. If you hit 100%, you're some fucking Korean guy who's like, you see him on YouTube and you're like, he's not real. And he's just hitting every single Tetris block and everything. Yeah, then you get the 100%. The concept I had was, it's the same concept I actually have in Counter-Strike when they balance the guns. I say, listen, you can have any gun as OP as you want. You can make it any price you want. Just make it so that the really OP aspect to it is really hard to do. And that way, if you can do it, I have to sort of tip my hat there. It's like in real life. Think about how real life works. If Steph Curry really can hit a higher percentage of three-point shots while being guarded where no one else can, then you have to just say, you win. In that scenario, you win. But the point is, in this situation, it's not that three-point shots are overpowered and anyone just switches to three-point shots and is better at that than whatever they did before. So unfortunately, it's a radical philosophy balance concept that I don't think is employed now. But I would do that personally, because the point is, there is a niche in the meta for all these things. It's just that some of them are the problem for me always becomes, so the 12 teams in the Overwatch League, if 9 of them can all do that thing and the 9th best player on that hero can do it and be super effective just automatically because of the meta, that probably tells me there's a problem with how difficult or how easy that particular thing is to execute. Like the idea everyone just ran dive is like, really? That tells me like you probably need to make some slightly more OP shit that's anti-dive, but that maybe takes skill to run, and therefore a couple of teams come up, that would be a way to, I guess, again, it's reverse engineering in a sense, but it's also not in a sense, because I'm trying to just give more tools to people.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand why this is even such a, like, nobody would say nerf 3-pointers in basketball, while a lot of people are currently saying nerf Widowmaker.
Yes.
But, like, how many Widowmakers do you not want to see Sire player pop off like that? I argue that's the most exciting part, seeing that excellent in sports, and him having at least a little bit the possibility to significantly impact the game that way. I would argue you want to actually try to create these scenarios where people like him can take over a game, and that is basically, personally, what I watch for.
Plus, that also actually leads me to another side thought, which is that whenever you nerf things, this has been a problem that has happened a lot in League of Legends, is that they nerf the kit and they think that nerfs the hero. Whereas the problem is there were certain champions in League of Legends, famous examples, Lee Sin. Lee Sin has had its head kicked in for years and years. And yes, it's not very viable now, but you could still pick it if you were the right player. And that was because its kit was too good. It was the same with Thresh for a long time. The kit is just so fabulous. Do whatever the fuck you want to the numbers and the whole joke was eventually Lee Sin got nerfed so much it wasn't a good hero, because if it went to the late game, its kit wasn't good enough. But what its kit could do early on just allowed you to impact the game so much that if you're a brilliant player, you went, right, well, I've got a clock on me of 20 minutes, but here's 20 minutes to go around and try and do a load of shit you can't do with anything else in the game. So that also will happen. So for example, off the top of my head as a layman, if you nerf Widowmaker tomorrow, it will still be played because, first of all, Widowmaker plays versus Widowmaker. So just making it worse will mean we still have Widowmaker comps, but they're both worse. And then secondly, it would also be the case that you would then probably just have inadvertently buffed another hero that wasn't as viable when Widows were too strong. So you would think that you were getting rid of Widow, you wouldn't. You'd just be sort of pushing it down a little bit. It'd still be there, and something else would pop up elsewhere, whack-a-mole style, and you wouldn't really fix it. So this is also why it's so tricky to make like the very... Essentially, in that scenario, what you did there is what everyone does. I do it myself sometimes if I don't think about it. You did like one variable factor analysis, which is Widowmaker's really strong. Nerf her damage or something, and you don't really realize like that's not all that a Widowmaker does. That's not all it would do to the meta. And also, what would the knock-on effect be? Like, does that make, like, for example, a certain tank way too OP? Now you can't stop this tank, and some fuckers just soaking up all the damage from everything now,
It's also just as the example of in League of Legends with Thresh and Lee Sin. Imagine if these heroes were never introduced as such. You could make the argument that legendary players like Madlife or Insect would have actually never made it onto the scene. Is that what we want for Overwatch? That we don't have these legends down the line because we keep cycling and they can't build that tenure or that, trophy case? Or I don't know. It's not satisfying to me.
This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, and a special thanks to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to get teasers for my upcoming work? Find out who's coming next, what topics are being discussed? Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear on one of my shows or in one of my videos? Would you like to ask a question in my monthly Patreon AMA, or perhaps even discuss esports as part of a discussion show I run on a monthly basis? Donators can also discuss the topics expounded upon in my videos with me and the other patrons on our Patreon page. All of this and more at the Patreon link below.